This is going to be our last set of notes for our Rome unit. And quite a bit of this slideshow is going to be review for us to get ready for our test next class. But we're going to go over Rome's legacy, or what the Romans have left behind for us that we still use today. And we're going to see that in many different areas, like we can see on this opening slide. As Rome conquers more and more territory and expands all the way across the Mediterranean, we get a mix of Roman, Greek, and Hellenistic cultures. We call that Greco-Roman culture. It's also known as classical civilization. So because of the conquest of the Romans, we have cultural diffusion around the Mediterranean world. Much of Western knowledge is based off of classical civilization. Although Western Europe will lose quite a bit of this knowledge after the fall of Rome, they'll enter into a period of time known as the Dark Ages. Eventually, we'll see a rebirth of these ideas in the 1500s in Italy. We call that the Renaissance. And the Renaissance thinkers look back on the Greeks and Romans for inspiration. We know so much about Roman society because many of the structures are still standing today. If you go to Italy or other areas that have been conquered by the Romans, you can not only find Roman ruins, but in some cases you can find structures that are completely intact. We also know a lot about Roman society because we've excavated the city of Pompeii. Pompeii was a town built near Mount Vesuvius. When Mount Vesuvius erupted, it covered the town of Pompeii in volcanic ash and pretty much left it as a time capsule for archaeologists to look at and figure out what Romans were doing right before they all perished. Architecture will be reviewed for us. We've talked about these different innovations before. The arch was created by the Etruscans and would eventually be used by the Romans, and it helps save building space. You don't need to build solid walls because you've got the arch. Domes are like having 360 degrees of arches, and it allows for these huge ceilings. We've got different monuments we'll look at, like the Pantheon, aqueducts, which bring water to the cities from the mountains, and of course the Roman roads, some of which are still intact today. We'll talk about the Pantheon first, and this was a temple to all of the Roman gods. Don't confuse it with the Parthenon, which was the Greek temple to Athena. Now we know the Greeks created columns. The Romans took that idea as well. They also used columns, but we know that this is not Greek because we've got the dome. And like we said before, if we have a dome, it's probably from Rome. So we have the Pantheon in Rome. Of course, this dome was so big they couldn't fill in the hole at the top without it collapsing, so instead we have the oculus. And we take inspiration from the Roman domes with our US Capitol building. You can see it is similar, as the founding fathers were huge fans of the Romans and their architecture style. We talked about the Circus Maximus, which is where you would go to watch the chariot races. Remember, the politicians of Rome thought that the mob needed to have bread and circuses in order to keep them distracted from their own miserable lives. The Colosseum is where we would go to watch the gladiator fights, once again providing entertainment for the people to distract them. Here we have the inside of the Colosseum. Once upon a time, back in the glory days of the Colosseum, there would have been wooden benches going across the stone support slabs. And we can see what would have been underneath the arena. It was covered by wooden beams and sand, but underneath you had all these different chambers for criminals, gladiators, and animals, and they would pop up through the floor using a trapdoor elevator system. We've looked at aqueducts as well. They make use of the arch. It helps support this almost like a bridge going across. And this would come from the mountains where you could get water, and it would bring water to the cities. These would have been covered by wooden planks over top to keep your animals out. The unfortunate part was that the Romans used lead to line the inside of the aqueduct. And of course, we know today that lead poisoning can cause brain damage and eventually death. These aqueducts are still standing, and you can get a scale of how big these aqueducts are based on the village we see in the background here. Ptolemy was actually a scientist during the Hellenistic era, but the Romans would follow him as well. He believed that the Earth was the center of the universe, and that would become known as the geocentric theory. And of course, it was wrong, but it wouldn't be until the scientific revolution, you guys will learn about that next year in World History 2, that we decided that the Earth actually revolves around the sun, the heliocentric theory. Roman art was different from that of Greek art. Roman sculptures were more realistic and less ideal than the Greek sculptures. The Greeks always tried to show things as perfect form, whereas the Romans showed things as they really were. If you were to see a bust of a Roman emperor, in most cases, the statue is going to show the flaws, wrinkles, and so forth that that person had in real life. The Romans also created bas relief sculptures. Those are images that project from a flat ground. They almost look three-dimensional. We'll see some examples. They used mosaics, images created from broken glass or shell that would be glued together in colorful patterns. And frescoes, which we talked about with the Minoans. That's where they would paint on plaster walls or ceilings, and as that plaster dried, the paint would be locked in, which is why we have this art in such great condition today. If we look at these two sculptures, we're going to look at the one on the left first. Do we think that is a Roman sculpture or a Greek sculpture? Go ahead and answer in the chat. Is it Roman or Greek? And we should be thinking that this is a Roman sculpture. You can see some of the wrinkles in the forehead, wrinkles on the face. So it shows the flaws of whoever this sculpture is of. And then on the right, that is a Greek sculpture. It shows perfect form. And that's because we don't see any flaws in the face. And that's what the Greeks believed the perfect person would look like, and that's what they spent their time sculpting. This is a bas relief sculpture, and it looks like it's coming out at you. Okay, it's like three-dimensional. Even the foot right here has been sculpted in such a way that it's actually hanging off the edge. So bas relief looks like it's projecting at you, which is much different than earlier art where they just carved into the slab. Of course, you can see bas relief if you go to Washington and look at the Martin Luther King Jr. Memorial. Again, it's sculpted so it looks like it's coming out of the slab of stone that it's been created on. We can see the difference between bas relief sculpture and these earlier sculptures. This one by the Egyptians, they carved directly into the stone and it did not look three-dimensional. Although it does have detail, it does not look three-dimensional whatsoever. And I don't know about this artwork, but the babies kind of look like little aliens. Here's an example of a Roman mosaic. Mosaic is when we take glass or shell and paste them together to create our artwork. And we've seen this before in the Greek and Minoan civilizations. Here is another example of a Roman mosaic, this time showing that they kept dogs for pets, which is a reason that I like the Egyptians better, because the Egyptians were all about the cats. Here are some Roman frescoes. Once again, this is painted on plaster. As the plaster dries, these colors are locked in. So they're in relatively good shape for being around 2,000 years old. In literature, we get the writer Virgil. His masterpiece is the Aeneid, and it was modeled after Homer's epics, the Iliad and the Odyssey. And it was written to show Rome's past was as heroic as that of Greece, and it promoted Roman virtues. And this was written around the time that Augustus became emperor. And it acts as a sequel to the Iliad, much like the Odyssey did for the Greeks. We also get Ovid, who writes light, witty poetry for enjoyment. This is a painting that was done well after the time of the Romans, but it shows the main character of the Aeneid. His name was Aeneas. He was actually a Trojan soldier. And when the Greeks finally burned down the city of Troy, he had to escape. Here he is with his father, carrying his father out of the burning city of Troy. And just like Odysseus goes on a journey in the Odyssey, Aeneas will do the same. He'll end up in North Africa and eventually Italy, and the Romans would claim him as one of their ancestors and one of the foundations for what would become the Roman world. The Romans also have a famous historian in Tacitus. He wrote the Annals and the Histories, and his goal was to present facts accurately, and he wrote about both the good and the bad. But when he was writing about bad emperors, he didn't write anything bad about them until they were dead, because he knew that if they read anything bad about themselves, he would be the one who would be executed. Government and law are considered the two most important achievements of the Romans. We use the system of representative government today in the United States. We call it the Republic, but it's used throughout the world in other countries as well. The idea that we have separate branches of government that have checks and balances over each other was a big idea that came from the Romans. Of course, the Romans wanted to make sure that not one branch or one person became all-powerful. And eventually this failed for the Romans, as under Augustus they did become an empire with one man in charge. So it was their greatest fear, but what they eventually became. The Roman laws are considered the most widespread and longest lasting achievement, even more important than the government. They came up with the idea that laws applied equally to all people. Now, the Romans weren't perfect. They had their share of problems. Slaves and women did not have rights. But the idea that whether you were rich or poor, own land or not, you would be treated equally in the court system was an important idea. Another one was that a person is innocent until proven guilty. It's up to the accuser to prove that the person did something wrong and not the other way around. You're punished for your actions, not your thoughts. So the idea of free speech, and unfair laws can be thrown away. If a law doesn't work anymore, we can change it or get rid of it. The Romans would also leave a legacy behind with their religion. Originally, they were polytheistic. They had Roman mythology, and their gods and goddesses were based off of the Greek gods and goddesses. And they would also incorporate other civilizations' gods and goddesses into their family of gods. They would eventually adopt Christianity as the official religion of the empire. Christianity was founded by Jesus, and it carried many of the same traits as Judaism, but with new ideas, such as the idea of forgiveness of sins and a personal connection with God. And because of the Roman Empire, Christianity will spread throughout the Mediterranean world, even though originally the Romans tried to shut down the promotion of Christianity. We will see this piece of artwork again during the Renaissance, but it shows Jesus in the middle, surrounded by his disciples or apostles. In the city of Rome itself, We have the Vatican City, which is considered its own country. And there we have St. Peter's Square and Basilica. So Rome is still the heart of the Roman Catholic Church, which is a denomination of Christianity. And finally, the Romans give us the Latin language. Latin is a dead language as they're not adding any new content to it. It's not changing or evolving like our language, English. But Latin is the language of learning. It's used in court and by scientists and doctors. So the terminology is still being used today. It's also the language of the Roman Catholic Church. Sometimes if you were to go to a Catholic church, they will have the service in Latin. And Latin will eventually develop into the Romance languages. And you do need to know these 5 languages that come from Latin. They are French, Spanish, Italian, Portuguese, and Romanian. And they're called Romance languages, not because it helps to get you a date, but because it comes from the word Roman. So you need to know that French, Spanish, Italian, Portuguese, and Romanian are derived from Latin. Like Latin, they have a lot of rules and are pretty easy to pick up compared to the Germanic languages like English or German. English is not a Romance language. We use a few words here and there from Latin, but it is Germanic and it's much harder to learn because while the Romans were big on rules, the Germanic peoples were not. So that's it for notes today. Again, a lot of this was review to help get you ready for your test next class.